Well, it's 12 o'clock noon here on the East Coast. Good afternoon or good morning to everyone joining. I'm David McAllister Wilson, president of the Wesley Theological Seminary, home of the Lewis Center for Church Leadership. And speaking on behalf of our whole team, I'm very grateful for your time today and your attention. And we look forward to your continuing involvement in this really unique project. I know you're joining us from all over the country and from many different theological schools. The phrase that comes to mind is from a hymn in my tradition, the Methodist tradition. The fellowship of kindred minds is like to that above. We all are part of a really unusual industry, are we not? And one that is going through profound change and challenge in the church and in those schools that are charged for preparing people for leadership in those churches. It seems in a way like a lifetime ago when we began our religious workforce project. And then it was very clear that this research was necessary because of the changing nature of the religious workforce across denominations and across the country. But then COVID hit, and that seemed to accelerate all of the trends we were suspicious of when we began the project and that we already knew we would discover. Little did we know that not only would this have such a profound effect on and continuing effect on churches and therefore on seminaries, but it also meant that this research became even more valuable as those of us who seek to prepare leaders might think a little bit now about what that means in light of the hard research that we're doing here at the Lewis Center in this project. Let me also say that I think whereas the ministry might be thought of as the oldest profession, we're also the least in touch with each other in many ways. We're all generalists, or usually are generalists. And it's not often that the seminaries and the leaderships of denominations have a chance to talk with each other, compare notes, and come up with strategies for effectiveness, say, as might happen in medicine. So we have a lot of hope that this research is an offering to you in your work, that it might help you think about how the church and seminaries can be more effective and indeed sustainable in our efforts. So I am grateful to you for being a part of this presentation today, to hear about the quantitative findings from our project, especially those that would be relevant to theological schools. And I know you will be blessed by the work of Dr. F. Douglas Poe, the director of our Lewis Center, Dr. Lovett H. Weems, and Dr. Amy Kubitschek, who have been working so directly on this project. So welcome and bless you in your ministry.
Thank you, David. I am Doug Poe, the director of the Lewis Center for Church Leadership. And let me just add my welcome to David's. And let me just add a few words about the Religious Workforce Project that, as David said, is a multi-year investigation that has a qualitative and a quantitative component. Today, you will hear about the quantitative component. The qualitative, we will be sharing information about that coming up soon. For the quantitative component, we have also used national survey data and statistics provided by multiple denominations. We've been very excited that many denominations have shared their data with us, covering typically from the year 2000, 2019, and that's some of what you will hear today. We also want to let you know that we're going to create about 10 research reports off of a lot of the data you will hear today concerning these trends. but your insights will be critical for helping us to really have the final report. So we're going to be sending out an online survey you'll receive this later today, this online survey, along with the slides and everything else. Please fill out the online survey. They're going to help us to create the final report where we'll not only talk about findings, but also implications and recommendations for you. Our presenters today are the founding director of the Lewis Center, Dr. Lovett Weems, and our research associate, Dr. Amy Kubicek. Lovett, please go ahead and lead us away.
Thank you, David, and thank you, Doug. And Amy and I are very honored to have this opportunity to share some of the findings we have. Most of these will be familiar to you, but we're hoping that by looking at these in a relatively condensed time frame will help us to begin the process of getting your ideas about what all this might mean for seminaries in the future. You find on the slide an outline that we'll be moving through, beginning with congregational trends from the last 2 decades, and then how those trends are leading to changes in the workforce, and then the changes in the workforce leading to changes in educational systems for that workforce. We'll also look at changes in clergy demographics over the last 2 decades, and then finally changes in seminary enrollment as we lead into times for both your questions, but particularly for your ideas, because we know that many of you are in the midst of conversations, just as we are, about what the shape of theological education is going to be in the future. So Amy is going to begin.
So we begin with a series of congregational trends impacting the religious workforce. In drawing from available denominational statistics, we cover a 20-year time period from 2000 to 2019, ending just before the pandemic, which affected many statistics. It's important to keep in mind, though, that the pandemic didn't really change the trends that we'll be talking about. It just accelerated the already existing trends. In drawing from national, in drawing from national survey research, most of the data comes from the same general 20-year time span. The trend that we'll begin with is one of the most obvious, and that is of declining attendance. The median worship attendance has declined by half, going from 130 in 2000 to 65 in 2020. Mainline denominations show even lower median attendance. The pace of declining attendance has been increasing. The one exception to this declining attendance trend is very large churches with 1,500 or more attendance, and especially among the newer non-denominational churches. The second trend is fewer new adherents, and this refers to the number of how many people are making first-time professions of faith each year. And these charts that you see on this slide show for different denominations the ratio of average worship attendance for each one profession of faith. So figures are shown for the years 2000 and 2019. Evangelical denominations, for which we have data, are on the left, and mainline denominations are on the right. So the lower the number that you see in these columns, the more effective denominations are in reaching new believers, at least based on this measure. Evangelical denominations show a mixed pattern of maintaining strong effectiveness in reaching new adherents. In some denominations, meaning lower ratios, such as in the Assemblies of God and the Wesleyan Church, and declining effectiveness, meaning higher ratios in other denominations such as the Church of the Nazarene and the Southern Baptist Convention. Mainline denominations are consistently less effective in reaching new adherents in 2019 than they were in 2000. Another related trend is that older people are overrepresented in US churches as aging becomes more pronounced. So for example, in 2020, 33% of church participants were 65 or older, while only 17% of the general population was of this age. But this age varies by religious traditions. So mainline Protestants tend to be the oldest, Catholic and evangelical Protestants are somewhat younger, and Black Protestants are the youngest, although they're still older than the overall population. A significant trend among Protestant denominations is the increase in numbers of small churches. In 2020, only 30% of churches had 100 or more attenders, which is where full-time clergy are most likely to serve. And this is down from 55% in 2000, according to Faith Communities Today research. So this chart is based on data from 7 evangelical and mainline Protestant denominations between 2000 and 2019. And you can see that their combined share of churches with fewer than 50 in average worship attendance increased from 41% in 2000 to 57% in 2019. And note especially that there were over 4,000 more churches with 25 or fewer attenders in 2019 than there were in 2000.
Now we begin looking at how these congregational changes lead to religious workforce changes. One change is that there are fewer clergy with MDiv degrees among mainline Protestants. The chart on the left shows the decline among PCUSA teaching elders of almost 25% between 2000 and 2019. The chart on the right shows the loss of United Methodist elders, those normally holding an MDiv degree, during a decline of almost 40% during a comparable time frame. In the United Methodist Church, this has resulted in the percentage of churches served by elders going from 64% in 2000 to 48% in 2019. Churches served part-time appear to be a growing occurrence across U.S. congregations, though the evidence of growth is not unanimous and methods of counting are not consistent. Part-time pastors, common among many traditions, are becoming more prevalent within denominations for which full-time ministry has been the assumed standard, even if the goal was never totally achieved. Increasing numbers of churches are unable to support financially a full-time pastor. Bivocational ministry has a long history, beginning with the Apostle Paul and continuing today worldwide. The Black church tradition provides perhaps the richest U.S. history with bivocational clergy. Bivocational clergy serve about a third of churches, and 30% of seminary graduates in North America plan to have a bivocational ministry. There's renewed interest today as fewer churches can afford a full-time pastor. Bivocational pastors are often more adept in reaching constituencies for which available and credentialed clergy have little to no cultural and social affinity. There are more lay pastors and lay workers. Evangelical and Black Protestant traditions have historically provided for multiple ways for persons to qualify to serve as pastors, thus requiring fewer adjustments in recent years. Today, pastoral leaders beyond ordained clergy with seminary degrees are needed more as pastors among all traditions. Mainline Protestants, because of declining church sizes, and Roman Catholics, due to a shortage of priests, have required the most adjustment to new circumstances. In addition to changes in pastoral leaders, where statistics are available for Protestant denominations, they show increasing percentages of personnel spending going for non-clergy staff. Roman Catholic parishes draw from increasing numbers of lay professional staff. Today, mainline denominations that once required the MDiv for all their clergy now are developing some alternative educational routes to ministry. One example is the Theological Education for Emerging Ministries used by the ELCA. United Methodists have had the course of study educational route to ministry from almost their beginning in the U.S. As more clergy went to seminary, course of study enrollment declined before taking a turn upward in recent decades. Today, almost 40% of United Methodist churches are served by course of study graduates, compared to a quarter in 2000. These programs are usually done in partnership with their denominational seminaries. The other shift among mainline denominations is the use of lay pastors. Some of the names of these pastors are listed here. There have been comparable changes within the Roman Catholic Church that have led to more non-priest personnel. Some of the factors leading to these changes for Catholics include Vatican II, fewer priests, fewer associate priests, and an increased number of parishes sharing a priest, leaving many parishes without a resident priest. Parish associates, parish life coordinators, and lay ecclesial ministers serve in smaller and more rural parishes with fewer resident priests, and in growing larger parishes with fewer associate priests available to them. There are currently 40,000 lay ecclesial ministers serving in parishes. With all the congregational changes, especially the increased numbers of very small churches, it is interesting that there are two types of clergy deployment that have not changed over the past 2 decades. Sharing a pastor appears to require a hierarchical clergy placement system. Sharing pastors is common only among Catholic and Methodist traditions. Such sharing among other denominations will probably increase due to the dramatic increase in very small churches, but modestly due to polity, resistance, and availability of willing partner pastors and congregations. Also, despite more retired clergy available to serve and more churches of the size they normally serve, 50 or fewer people, the percentage of churches served by retired pastors has remained relatively constant since 2000. There is little indication that retired clergy are the primary source to serve the growing pool of very small congregations. We now turn to examine changes in clergy demographics that Amy will lead. You're on mute, Amy.
Sorry about that. We'll begin by looking at clergy age trends. The percentage of lead pastors 55 or older increased over 42% since 1998. About 60% or more of Black, evangelical, and mainline Protestant lead pastors are 55 or older, which is shown by the green and purple segments of the bars combined. Roman Catholic clergy shifted somewhat younger since 1998. These columns show age groups using blue for under 35, red for 35 to 54, and green for 55 to 72. The column on the far left shows the age breakdown of the US population of people ages 25 to 72. The columns that follow to the right show clergy age breakdowns for Black Protestant, evangelical Protestant, mainline Protestant, and Roman Catholic traditions. And you will see that there is a dramatic and unprecedented gap between the makeup of the population ages 25 to 34 and the scarcity of clergy younger than 35 in all religious traditions. We next turn to trends related to clergy gender. In this chart, the blue columns represent women MDiv graduates, and the red columns represent women lead and solo pastors. The comparisons are for three religious traditions: Black Protestant on the left, evangelical Protestant in the center, and mainline Protestant on the right. For many years now, the percentage of women MDiv graduates from seminaries has surpassed their presence as lead pastors. We look now at comparisons across specific denominations for which we have the necessary data. This chart shows what percentage of churches have women as solo or lead pastors in 2000 and 2019. The blue represents 2000 changes, and red columns designate 2019 changes. And women as lead pastors have increased since 2000 in each of these denominations shown here. This next chart looks at changes in the attendance size of churches served by women as a percentage of the attendance size of churches served by men in 2000 and 2019. And again, the blue represents 2000 percentages and the red represents 2019 percentages. So each column shows the median attendance of churches served by women compared to churches served by men in each of the 2 years. So for an example, okay, so as an example, for ELCA in 2019, women served churches with 72% the number of attenders as churches served by men. Okay. The percentage of churches with 251 or more in attendance led by clergy women has gone up, although this progress is limited and varies considerably across denominations. And for each of the denominations shown in this chart, there are 3 percentages that are shown. The first column in each set, the blue, represents the percentage of churches with 251 or more in attendance served by clergy women in 2000. The second column in each set, the red, represents the percentage of congregations with 251 or more in attendance served by clergy women in 2019. And the third column in each set, the green, represents the percentage of all churches served by clergy women in 2019. One final word on clergy gender comparisons takes us back to the earlier slides that we looked at that show the makeup of the church pool and how it's changed in the past 2 decades. So we need to remember that gains in parity for clergy women come within a context of congregational decline, and that this means there are more limited opportunities for both women and for men. We now turn to trends related to clergy race. Historical and cultural factors in the U.S. have shaped the racial and ethnic composition of congregations and clergy in each Christian tradition. And no predominantly white denomination has a history to which it can look back with in pride. The greatest growth in racial and ethnic diversity occurred in the Roman Catholic tradition, especially with the increased share of Hispanic priests. However, clergy race analysis in most denominations is difficult because racial designations for clergy are usually not a part of the statistical reports. So first we'll begin by looking at clergy race trends within the evangelical Protestant tradition. So the chart on the left shows that across evangelical Protestant denominations, 73% of solo or lead pastors are white, which is about the same as the racial membership of these denominations. There is some growing diversity among evangelical Protestant MDiv graduates. The chart on the right shows the racial and ethnic composition of MDiv graduates from evangelical Protestant seminaries in 1998, 2006, 2012, and 2018. The white percentage of MDiv graduates declined from 81% in 1998 to 66% in 2018. And the greatest percentage growth has come among Black and Hispanic MDiv graduates, with smaller gains for Asian graduates. We'll now look at clergy race trends within the mainline Protestant tradition. Again, the chart on the left shows that across mainline Protestant denominations, 90% of solo or lead pastors are white, which is about the same as the racial membership of these denominations. There's been some growing diversity among mainline clergy, and this should continue given the increased racial and ethnic diversity of MDiv graduates from mainline seminaries over the past few decades, which you can see in the chart on the right. So the chart on the right, again, shows the racial and ethnic breakdown of MDiv graduates from mainline Protestant seminaries from 1998 to 2018. The white percentage of MDiv graduates from mainline seminaries declined from 84% in 1998 to 69% in 2018. And similar to evangelical Protestant seminaries, the greatest percentage growth has come from among Black MDiv graduates, with more modest gains for Hispanic and Asian graduates. And finally, we look at clergy race trends within the Roman Catholic tradition. So the chart on the left shows that in the Roman Catholic Church, in 2018, 53% of priests, or solo or lead priests, were white, which is somewhat less than the white makeup of their membership. This is a major change since 1998, when 97% of priests leading parishes were white. And this overwhelming change since 1998 is due to the increase in Hispanic priests, which went from just 2% in 1998 to 33% in 2018. The chart on the right depicting the racial makeup of Catholic MDiv graduates from 1998 to 2018 shows more modest gains among Hispanic students. And this is because most of the increased Hispanic diversity among Catholic clergy has come from priests from other countries.
Next, we look at changes in seminary enrollments between 2000 and 2020 in light of all the other changes occurring during these 2 decades. While many lead pastors have graduate degrees, there is much variation among traditions. The MDiv shows resilience even for students for whom it is not a church requirement. Yet there are also trends away from seminary degrees for clergy. Given some of the congregational trends we're seeing, it is not surprising to see that some seminary enrollment is declining. This chart shows enrollment for all mainline denominational students in any ATS accredited seminary between 2000 and 2020. The blue portion shows a 50% decline in MDiv enrollment. The red portion shows a more modest decline in other professional master's degrees. The blue portion of this chart shows a 10% decline in MDiv enrollments of all evangelical Protestant denominational students in any ATS accredited seminary between 2000 and 2020. This decline becomes 20% if the large numbers and more modest losses of Southern Baptists are excluded. The red portion shows minimal decline in other professional master's degrees. Black Protestant enrollment declines are less than mainline, but more than evangelical, with virtually all of the decline occurring in the MDiv degree programs. Total Catholic enrollments declined 13%, which, similar to evangelical Protestants, shows relative stability compared to other traditions. Let's look at an example of growth in enrollment of students during this time period from the Wesleyan Church. Wesley Seminary of Indiana Wesleyan University is the only seminary of the Wesleyan Church. Wesley's ATS accreditation in 2014 marked a pivotal point in the increase of Wesleyan Church students at ATS seminaries. 3 things stand out in the way they structured their programs: affordable, accessible, and directly applicable. We highlight these attributes because they capture many of the efforts other seminaries are attempting in one way or another. All schools recognize the financial strain students face and are addressing it primarily through increases in financial aid. Most schools are making their offerings more accessible through online, hybrid, and intensive offerings. But few schools are able to make their curriculum as directly and immediately applicable to students as Wesley Seminary of IWU. With most of their students serving churches, they developed ways to incorporate the students' context, including mentoring, to enrich the educational experience. Now, here are just a few observations. Vitality tends to outweigh virtually everything else. If a religious tradition is vital and growing and expanding, then there's an increased need for leadership and for leadership education. Second, seminary patterns vary by constituents. For example, in the last 2 decades, a seminary that was very attractive for non-denominational students would have done very, very well, while a seminary most attractive to mainline Protestant students would not have done so well. 3, seminary enrollment is far more diverse than the makeup of solo or lead pastors in congregations. And for many years, we saw that simply as a lag time issue, but that doesn't account for all of it since it's continued for so long. 4th, Seminaries have made major adjustments to address the changing nature of those seeking theological education. Will those operational changes be sufficient? Or does the changing religious environment require a more radical rethinking, such as is proposed by books such as The End of Theological Education by Ted Smith? Now, we want to turn to a time of discussion, including any questions that for clarification you may have, but primarily we would like to hear from you about how you see these trends, or some of these trends, impacting the work of your theological schools, and what you see as changes in the future landscape for theological schools. As Doug Poe mentioned earlier, we will be publishing before long at least 10 research reports on different components that we've talked about here today, where we document across denominations some of these trends. But the bigger issue that we want to address before ending the project will come from insights such as those you have about what does all this mean and what are the implications? What might we learn about things of the future? So you can feel free to use the chat feature as a way of submitting questions, but we're a small enough group that feel free just to speak up with a question or a contribution that you might make. We would really love to learn from you. And we do have, I mentioned the Wesley Seminary at IWU example. I think we have at least one person from Wesley Seminary on with us. Yes, Cami, thank you for being here. First of all, I might just ask you, was that a fair representation of what we were saying about how your program has developed within its context?
Yeah, thank you. It's always nice to see a chart that's like all going up. So, so thank you so much. Took a screenshot of that. But yeah, I think because we're one of the youngest seminaries, and we only have experienced like a lot of growth because we've had a short lifespan. But we were kind of known as like this weird seminary doing some really different things when we started. And I've been here for over 10 years now, working in enrollment at the seminary. And so yes, I think it was really accurate. And, there's challenges, just like everyone is facing challenges, but that is, something that we think has helped our growth from when we started, is just offering, modalities and offering things that were going to be extremely applicable. So I felt like it was well represented.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Love it. This is Mark Hearn from Church Divinity School of the Pacific, and we're here with others on the executive team here.
Oh, thank you.
Want to hear possibly more on that point number 3, and it was also in the slide about the 90, especially in the mainline Protestant churches, 90% are white clergy, but the very next slide was the number in seminary are more diverse than that. And you had said in your that longitudinally it might be just because it hasn't caught up, but you actually said, but there are other possible reasons. Could you talk about what those other possible reasons might be?
Well, in terms of race, what we're seeing is that, and I'm not sure how this would be in your tradition, but I know that there are a number of mainline theological schools where their MDiv graduates don't necessarily represent mainline traditions. And so they are not going to show up as solo or lead pastors in those traditions, even though they have degrees from mainline seminaries. There are other factors, partly based on polity of denominations. With gender, what we're seeing is that, as Amy mentioned, you can see the progress, if you will, in some equity among gender, but it's coming within a pool that has shrunk. And so a lot of what appears to be progress is that the range of possibilities is far less today. And so what men, if you're comparing women and men, what's available for men, there are far fewer churches available for anybody. So you have fewer men serving, say, larger churches and all, because there aren't that many anymore. Sometimes it's a matter of polity, but what we're finding is interesting in terms of the mainline, in terms of gender, is that two of the traditions that have the best statistics on clergy women as solo or lead pastors come in two systems where congregations make those decisions, essentially Episcopal and UCC, whereas you'd think a more hierarchical system where somebody else is naming the pastor might be at the top of that. In terms of evangelical churches, and well, it's true with mainline also, it's looking at that persons who are serving their same race and where there are cross-racial appointments. And sometimes we have good statistics on those, but often we do not. Amy, do you have anything you want to contribute on that, since you've done some of that research?
Let me think. So, yeah, I guess I kind of wanted to chime in a little bit about with, like kind of going along with what you said about the seminary enrollment. So, for example, there were a number of students, say, who came from historically Black denominations who were enrolled in, maybe Methodist mainline seminaries. Yeah, I think that's pretty much it.
Thank you. Others?
David and Amy, I was just wondering, there's so many reports about the projected retirements of baby boomer ministers and staff or professionals, as well as the quiet resignation, shall we call it. And I'm just wondering how those two trends impact the data, the research that you've done, for which I'm very grateful. It's very nice to have. That said, to compare, I'm in a PCUSA context, so to see where there's overlap, but where there's also a different interpretation. So thank you so much for this presentation. So again, my question, baby boomer retirement, quiet resignation, where do you see the impact?
Well, you know, the movement of the baby boom generation through the population, and the baby boom generation was the largest generational group until a couple of years ago when the millennials became the largest. That has been used as the reason why there's been this virtual almost absence of under 35 clergy for so long. And there is truth to that, in that the category, the age category of church clergy that has really suffered the most has been this group of clergy age 35 to 54. And much of that comes from changes in the population as so many moved into that older range. And there's been this tremendous increase in clergy 55 or older. Throughout this 20-year period, we've been at these historically low percentages of 5-6% or lower under 35. But the thing that the baby boom movement does not explain is the absence of the younger clergy, because they're about 25% between the ages of 25 and 35 in the population, and it's been virtually absent. Now, since the 1990s and the increase in the so-called nuns, no religious affiliation, that's been primarily a younger, not exclusively, but primarily a younger phenomenon. And that may have made a difference as well. Also, many traditions with fewer young clergy have for many years had fewer children and fewer youth in their memberships. And when we did a survey several years back of all under 35 United Methodist clergy, we found that what they had most in common was that they had been active in church as children and they'd been active in church as youth. So it stands to reason that if you've got fewer children, fewer youth, you're going to have fewer young clergy. Now, on the retirement side, denominations will see, they'll see 20 people retire in a year and maybe 2 or 3 new people coming in. And there was, there's a time when there's been talk of clergy shortage, but that talk has to be very nuanced, because there are fewer churches, certainly in mainline denominations, that each year are large enough to support a full-time seminary educated pastor. And I say especially in the mainline, because in the mainline, predominantly, you have judicatories that set minimum salary requirements, and there can be variation within that. But that's why almost all traditions are having to find alternative routes for these people to become educated. And in the United Methodist Church, we have a group, it's what I call our undocumented clergy, that it's thousands who are called by different euphemisms, but supply pastor is one and DS assignments another. But these are people who are not a part of the course of study program. They're not in seminary or have seminary degrees. And what training there is, it's left locally, and it varies considerably. So, but everyone is having to deal with this. So with the large retirements, it's not necessarily that where churches are being served, they're being replaced by people who have seminary degrees.
Thank you.
Well, I'd love to jump in here and also just echo the gratitude others have expressed to you, Doug, Amy, David, and Deb. It's really remarkable work and will be helpful in so many ways. I'm coming from Truett Theological Seminary at Baylor University, and I'm really interested in kind of what's happening at the edges of this data. You all have painted a really clear and compelling portrait about some of the trends. I'm particularly curious about where the data might point. I mentioned this question in the chat, but it seems like there's this tension inherent to it, where there's undeniable decline across sectors, across institutions, across denominations. But it seems like the spaces of vitality and growth seem to be along this professional MA and also the expanding range of religious vocations. I just think in my context, we have a whole host of people who don't come to the seminary, but they're in the School of Social Work, or they're pursuing graduate degrees in other fields, or they go into law or business. And many of these people think about the work they're doing as ministry, but it likely wouldn't be counted in some of the way the data is configured here. Could you talk a little bit more about what's happening on the margins of the data, particularly amid the expanding range of religious vocations?
Well, one place you could see this is looking at the makeup of people who are in other master's degrees in theological schools, because that's where you'll find many of the people that you are talking about. They don't need a degree for a particular credential. They do need the education. And I think I saw just recently where Yale Divinity School celebrated that their entering class had a few more MDivs than Master of Arts, which was the first time in a number of years. And you'll notice in these charts that in terms of professional master's degrees, even though most of our schools have been churning out more of these offerings, we're not seeing as many students there. Roman Catholics have had that solid non-MDiv master's enrollment for a number of years. And when you think about it, I mean, the Roman Catholic schools start with the disadvantage that the pool of a priest is limited to men. And in some ways, the other masters have been the places where women have found ways to express their callings using the education that they have there, but not as priests. I think when you see the number of people coming out of a couple of years of service, like a Peace Corps Vista or something like that, and then coming to seminary, they have been shaped often by things other than those whose total formation came from congregations. So parachurch ministries, campus ministries, particularly mission-oriented types of things have shaped them. And so they may not be seeing a local congregation as their place of ministry. Some schools are directly trying to address students that have that primarily more social work kind of interest, sometimes through joint degrees, but also in how they're shaping some of their master's programs. So in terms of growth, there's this dilemma. On the one hand, theological schools and the congregations, and in some cases the denomination or denominations that have shaped them, have a claim on them. And on the other hand, the mission of the theological schools is reaching people like you have described, who may be coming out of the church, but that's not their particular vocational direction. I may be missing the point. I think I understand what you're saying. I may not be addressing that as directly. Feel free to follow up if you want to, Dustin.
Yeah, thank you, Levitt. And I will have to step off momentarily to care for a sick kiddo.
Okay.
So I'll be brief and then hand the conversation over to someone else. I think that the trajectory of my question is trying to think about what might follow this really interesting data, because it seems like there's an interesting set of questions that could be explored about people who aren't captured in this current data, because you all have done a remarkable job capturing data from the fixed set of organizations that come from ATS accredited theological schools and identified the denominational forms. My sense, based on some of my research, is that there are interesting things happening on the edges of these organizational forms and actually in some ways between them. One just hypothetical example would be to figure out how to sample and capture people of faith beyond ATS schools who are pursuing graduate degrees in some way that might be informed or motivated by faith, but they have no interest in entering seminary. That would be a really interesting comparative sample to compare what trends that might have alongside some of this really interesting trends from ATS schools. Because my hunch is that there's still vitality, but it just might not be in the existing spaces or the place we've looked for the last several years.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Yeah, and thank you. Thanks to the team.
So, Lovett, I'd put a couple things in the chat and just a couple quick questions. The first one is kind of along the same lines. I'm just curious if in some of the research that you've done, if you've seen an increase in dual enrollment programs. I'm really curious about education for the growing number of people who will be in part-time ministry. And then the second one is more denominational specific, just related to the United Methodist Church and the increasing number of congregations served by people who have gone through course of study. And I'm just curious if you have a sense of how the disaffiliation process might affect that number.
Well, beginning on the latter point, we do know that of the United Methodist Churches disaffiliating, and that's a process that's been going on for a couple of years, supposed to end on December 31. For those unfamiliar with the United Methodist from current realities and divisions primarily over the issue of sexuality, but of the churches that are disaffiliating, the lead pastors of those churches are persons who've gone to course of study or lay supply pastors are more represented than our elders in that. And so there will be fewer of them disproportionately, but or proportionately, but the trends in size of church, which is really what determines who's serving these churches, that's not going to change, because the size of disaffiliating churches is virtually identical with the size of those that are staying. The median age of both groups is 38. And the median age of United Methodist congregations, or the median attendance before disaffiliation was 38. So there's probably not going to be a lot of change in that. Now, remind me again of the question just before that.
Oh, sure. Just maybe a comment for in your data, if you found anything about like dual enrollment programs and preparation for part-time or bivocational ministry?
Well, we don't have anything about the dual degree, but that would be a very interesting thing and probably relatively easy to gather. Here's where traditions like the United Methodist Church, I think, really have to rethink bivocational ministry. You know, it's only been in recent years that an elder could serve part-time. That the assumption was you were serving full-time. And if in cases where somebody might take a part-time job driving a school bus or a paper route or something, they'd get the call before the cabinet or the board of ordained ministry immediately, because that's not possible. But now, there are ways that you can be appointed to half-time or three-quarter. The other thing that affects many denominations is that if someone is not full-time, they are seen as kind of a different category of pastor. And when you think about how annual conferences are planned or any conventions are planned, pastor schools are planned, judicatory meetings are planned, almost all of those have the assumption that this is a pastor who's available during the week for these things, and that's often not the case. Now, I had an interesting comment made by a conference minister in UCC. She said that when someone comes feeling a call to ministry and wanting to quit their profession, get a seminary degree, and be a UCC pastor, what she's telling them now is use the options available for flexibility to do a seminary degree, but do it over a period of years. Keep your profession. And there will always be somewhere where you can do important ministry and you can continue to support your family as well. She said the reality is that if you go to seminary and get a seminary degree and then come back requiring a full-time church, I really don't have anywhere to suggest to you right now, because so many of the full-time churches in the UCC have become part-time. Also, this bivocational concept, and there are different words used for it, but for many, the other vocation, retired clergy serving churches, that's really bivocational. They have a vocation of retirement, and then they have this other vocation. But that other retirement sometimes is for caring for family, or the other vocation is volunteer work, or the other vocation is writing or something like that. And so if we can start thinking about how that's the case, and it doesn't mean people have less pastoral leadership. For instance, in Washington, there's a small Baptist church that has a YDS graduate as their pastor who works at the Department of Justice. There are many churches in the DC area that have people that show up as staff, as pastors of one sort or another, who have seminary degrees. They have other jobs. Sometimes they're paid, sometimes they're not paid. And what we're noticing is when we look at churches that have multiple clergy, these tend to be relatively limited and getting fewer among places that assume that full-time ministry or assume a seminary education and giving full time to that. But in evangelical denominations, where you have clergy that are doing a lot of different things, a church may have 5 or 6 associate clergy, some of which are paid, some are not. So the dynamic of how people are looking at these things changes. So it's almost as if, like at our seminaries, we will have groups that form around common identities or interests. It may be that those who are looking toward bivocational ministry may be one. The data from Joanne Deasy at ATS points out that in their surveys, 30% of students are saying they're considering that. And so but we're not prepared for it. And as we said, the bivocational pastors tend to have a good experience. They've got some challenges and don't feel they're treated fairly in some ways. But the prospect of if you go to clergy who are not bivocational, and you raise that prospect to them, they're not very excited about that. And you go to a congregation and who have not had that experience, they're not going to be very excited about it either. When the actual people who are doing it, they have a good experience. So we've got to be more open, and there are fewer churches every year that can support that full-time pastor.
Hey, Dorothy, I think you had a question about certificate programs.
Yes, and following up to the observation, how are we paying attention to what's going on the margins? My question was whether you all project that offering certificates as an alternative, especially for professionals who want to be in a bivocational setting, but would like to do so by deepening their own theological understanding or practices. Do you see certificates as part of a future training tool? And there's always pros and cons to that. To what degree, how many courses, how is it accredited? But I think we are going to have to find new ways. Okay, this is adaptive leadership. Dr. Powell, I'm still do it. But we will have to find different ways. And I think it could really lead to some very fruitful discussions between persons who are in a more traditional setting and persons who are, as you said, Lovett, immersed in some context. So I'm just wondering what that could look like.
Well, I know David and Doug are involved with some of this through our seminary's Pathways project. I'd comment first that things like Hispanic Bible Institutes represent one type of effort. That is, really for a theological school, if you say, how do we picture our student? Who do we see as those that we serve? Many of those that have represented that typical student in the past, there are fewer of them. And yet there are more people in other areas. One is represented by those who are educated Hispanic Bible Institutes, but you also have the growing lay professionals on staffs. In 1989, 75% of all the personnel spending in United Methodist churches went for clergy. Now it's like 52%. And what we found is that this spending on lay staff, the proportion of personnel spending has gone up in every size category, although it's primarily a phenomenon of 100 plus attendance churches, but the pattern is seen everywhere. And so you've got these persons, and then larger churches, a lot of times, they like to hire people from within their congregation, and they have a lot of part-time people there. Well, there may be someone who's very gifted in music or in children's work or youth work or something, but they've had no real theological education ever. That's a tremendous pool of people. And others. Doug, you or David want to say anything about the more specific certificate question that Dorothy's raising?
David, go ahead.
We're not hearing you, David.
We're not hearing you, David.
Doug, why don't you?
Yeah, let me just say a few words while David works on his sound. We think particularly for there's great opportunity, and I've talked particularly about United Methodists. Lovett was talking earlier about those who are supply pastors, and that the supply pastors, there is not an official sort of educational route for them because they're not actually included in course of study. So we, along with others like Candler and Air, have a Pathways 3 grant through Lilly. So as a part of our grant, one of the things that we're doing is actually creating a certificate for those supply pastors, where they would be able to be connected to a seminary, Wesley Seminary, to have a form of training from seminary professors that they wouldn't receive otherwise, typically just within possibly their conference, which is more hit or miss depending on what conference they're in. But we think those sort of certificate programs are definitely growing edges, and to some extent, particularly for standalone seminaries, are going to be critical for a part of the makeup of their future moving forward. David, have you been able to get your sound back? No, he did. So I don't know what David has done with his sound, but I'll leave it there, and but happy to speak more about that. But we're excited about those opportunities.
Thank you.
Okay, as we come closer to the end, are there other comments or questions or things you'd have? Thank you so much for this time. As Matt mentioned earlier, later today, you will receive a link to a recording from this. You'll also receive a PDF that includes the slides that were on the PowerPoint. And there'll be a 3-question online survey. And this is very important to us as we begin exploring beyond what is and what might this mean for the future. As I said, we'll be issuing research reports and have further ways to share some information on this. And feel free to stay in touch if you'd like to pursue some things further. Thank you very much. Thank you for joining us. Goodbye. Good to see all of you.